afraid to do my presentation. You did a great job. I want to thank all of you very much for coming here tonight. I'm really excited to be here at Books and Books. The Purloined Legacy took 2 years to write, and let's see what I was going to say here. It took 2 years to write, so I want to thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedules and joining me on this happy occasion for my first novel. I also want to thank Books and Books. They've been around here for over 30 years, and if you take a walk back to the cafe there, you'll see that there are pictures, a gallery of pictures, and there have been all kinds of celebrities and well-established authors who have had books events in this same venue. And so I'm honored to be among those authors who have had book events in this very room. Before I tell you a little bit about the Purloined Legacy, I want to take just a couple minutes to thank two very special people that were very supportive in my endeavor to write a full-length novel. The first I want to thank is my husband, John. During the whole process, he was steadfast with his encouragement. He never let me stop. He was just great. And because I work in the legal field, the only time that I have to write is either late at night after work, in the mornings, or on the weekends. And many times when he would ask me, if we didn't have something planned on a weekend, if we didn't have something, he would ask me what I wanted to do. And more often than not, I would say, I want to write. And he never had a problem with that, so I was really grateful. And in the preface of my book, I say that John, it was a great journey with John by my side, and I absolutely mean that. The other person that I am indebted to, besides you, the reader, is Hope Johnson. Where are you, Hope? She's a very good friend of mine. She is also my sister-in-law, and she's also my editor. Hope was my editor from the first moment that I started writing. I had 3 or 4 pages, and Hope wanted to read them. And then each time she was very enthusiastic, and she was very excited to read every page. And every once in a while she'd go, well, what do you have for me? And I'd have I'd have 50 pages, and then she'd read them. And then I'd have 100 pages, and she'd read that. And then she'd read it over again, and she was really great. And I'm really lucky because she's an amazing English teacher she's taught for over 30 years. Actually, I was corrected tonight, it's over 40 years. And she has a great love, she's a great teacher, and she has a great love of words and how they come together to describe things. So Hope was she was invaluable to me throughout the entire journey of writing a novel that I would be proud to publish. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Mark Goldberg, who's also here, right there. Mark designed the front and back cover of my book, and I was thrilled with it. So if you write a novel and you need a book cover, Mark's your man. Mark has also written a bunch of books on his own. He's published a bunch of books, and including the Aubrey Carlisle series. And then lastly, I want to give a shout out to another writer here who's here tonight, and that's my friend Connie Perez, who's had the camera. She's been very nice to take pictures. Anyway, she wrote a very enjoyable book of reflective essays that's called Scenes That Are Lasting and Other Essays. It was just 3 or 4 months ago that we were here at Books and Books celebrating her first book. When I tell people that I've written a book, most people ask me 2 questions. They either ask me, what's your book about, or what made you write it? Excuse me. The quick synopsis of the Purloined Legacy is that it's a mystery with a little bit of history, a little bit of romance, and a saga, excuse me, a saga of the fictional Delaney family starting back in 1806 and traveling through the current time. The more detailed version of the Purloined Legacy is that it's a story within a story. You have the current story, which is sort of a whodunit, a mystery. And then you have a backstory that deals with the history of the Delaney family. And in the current story, you have the main character, Samantha Delaney, who is a self-made pediatric surgeon, and she conquered many adversities in her life, including losing her parents when she was only 20 years old. Her parents died in a plane crash. Since her dad had been estranged from his family, she never grew up knowing any of the Delaney family, and she didn't know any of the family history. When Samantha was in med school at the University of Florida, and you guys that know me will know why I picked U of M for Samantha to go to school, but When she was in med school, she developed a very close friendship with a classmate by the name of Brett Perry. They became good friends, and later after they finished their medical school, they opened up a medical pediatric clinic together. And one day, Samantha, while she's at the clinic, she receives a letter from an attorney in France advising her that an old French woman by the name of Francesca Beauvais had bequeathed a trunk full of memorabilia, letters, pictures, diaries, and the like. The old French woman had also passed away at her desk while writing a letter to Samantha, in which she implored her to try to find out what happened to the purloined or stolen Delaney legacy. Although Samantha had never heard about Madame Beauvais, she had become intrigued, and it was fortuitous for her because now she had an opportunity to learn about the Delaney family that she never knew about. The current story will take you on Samantha's journey to try to unravel the clues that were contained in Madame Beauvais's trunk and all the memorabilia to try and figure out what happened to the Delaney family's wealth and to find out who harmed the family and to bring them to justice. That was the old woman's, her request, her posthumous request. In the backstory, and that's the legacy part of the story, the Purloined Legacy will detail the adversities and triumphs that made up the lives of Samantha's ancestors between the 1800s and the 1940s. Samantha learns all about the ancestors through the old French woman's trunk of memorabilia. Also in that trunk, Madame Beauvais had included a book that she had written, and that book chronicled the lives of the Delaney family, so Samantha was able to learn about her relatives through Francesca's eyes, which was very enlightening for her. Madame Beauvais's book also gave her a source of information that helped her to piece together some of the trails of information to try to solve the mysteries of what happened to the wealth in the Delaney family and what happened to the Delaney family. And that had haunted the old woman for over 30 years. And then there was the factor of the ill-begotten wealth that was stolen from the Delaney family, and that's what really bothered Madame Beauvais, and she definitely wanted to have it righted. So since the backstory covers about 150 years, there was a lot of historical events that occurred during that time, which gave me a lot of historical material to work with. Most of the backstory of the legacy takes place between 1815 and 1880. So in the United States, at that time, you had the gold rush in California in 1849, you had the Civil War in 1861, people traveled by steamship, we had the first transcontinental railway, and then because some of the story takes place in Ireland, the Delaneys are in Ireland, and they're in Bordeaux, and they're in New York and California, you had in Ireland at that same era, at that same time, you had the potato famine. And then in France, in Bordeaux, the vineyard industry was haunted by the ups and downs of the Napoleon Bonaparte's influence, as well as the natural disaster that destroyed all the vineyards. So that touches on a little bit of the historical events that occurred during the mid-1800s. So when I wrote the backstory, it was loads of fun for me because it was a huge challenge to try and weave in those historical moments into my plot, and I tried as hard as I could to make it as accurate and as authentic as I could. So that's the more detailed answer about what the Purloined Legacy is all about. The second question that people tend to ask me is, why'd you write it? Well, like everyone has said before, I did write. I have written a lot of things, including children's books and poetry and songs. But I never thought about writing a full-length novel until one day John and I, my husband John and I, were looking at old family pictures, and we looked at old letters, and some of them dated back to the gold rush days, and there were letters from other ancestors all across the United States and some in Europe. And we found that history very fascinating. And then there were even references to distant relatives that had ties to vineyards in France, and then I got really totally plugged into it. Anyway, John and I went through all the memorabilia, and he got the idea that it'd be really cool to write a fictional book about the Phelan family. So since he's a lawyer and he writes legal stuff, and I'm the casual writer in the family, we initially decided to collaborate on the book and write a fictional novel together about the Phelan family. Well, I was really excited, so the next day I sat right down at the computer and I cranked out 3 or 4 pages that I perceived to be the start of the book. While I had the ideas about the Phelan family in my head, I didn't have too many specifics about the daily routines of the family, so I began to create the beginnings of a family saga. I started out by focusing on one particular Phelan ancestor that stood out for both John and me, and that was a young man by the name of Gregory J. Phelan, whose parents had come to the United States from Ireland, and they were poor, they had no contacts with anybody in the U.S., but somehow that young man, Gregory Phelan, went to put himself through medical school, and he later landed a job as a ship's surgeon that went on a vessel from New York to California. And he settled, this is about the time of the gold rush, 1850. And so the young Phelan doctor ends up settling in Sacramento, and he marries, has 6 children, and he becomes one of the founders of the Medical Society of California. That's all factual of the Phelan family. Gregory Phelan's oldest son also ends up following his father's footsteps as a doctor, and in his mid-30s, he was the very first chief medical officer to be assigned to the U.S. government by the U.S. government to a foreign consulate, and that consulate was in Bordeaux, France. He ends up marrying a French girl, so that's how we think the part of the family ends up in Bordeaux. And then there's also some references to people coming from, the Phelan family coming from Ireland to Bordeaux, which is where we get the link to the Phelan Sigur. That bottle, I brought a bottle with me tonight. I can't offer it to everybody, but it's the bottle from the Phelan Sigur vineyard in Bordeaux, France, and we think we're somehow related. There's pretty good evidence that we are related, and I just love to think that I am related, even by marriage. But for those of you that have actually read the Purloined Legacy, I'm sure you're now thinking that the description of Gregory J. Phelan is my character, George Delaney, who is a doctor. He travels by steamship through the Isthmus of Panama. He goes to San Francisco. He settles in Seattle. He has a son who becomes a doctor and moves to France. So I think I did stay true to some aspects of the Phelan family. But getting back to the Purloined Legacy, when I sat down at the computer with the intent to write a book, I started out with a character who I perceived would be the matriarch of the Phelan family. And this lady came over from Ireland to New York, and in real life, that woman's name was Nora Kelly. So, in the real life Phelan family. So that's what I named our character. The one snag in this writing adventure, together with my husband, was when John took a look at those first 3 or 4 pages that I wrote, it wasn't quite what he was envisioning. As my accounting was purely fictional, and he wanted fiction, but he also wanted to kind of track the Phelan family a little bit more than I had done, and mine was just way away from the Phelan family. So a couple of days passed, and as all good lawyers do, he got busy and distracted with clients, so I sort of went on my own and kept writing about I wrote about the fictional family that I now call the Delaneys. And so from that day forward, the Purloined Legacy took on a life of its own, and I continued by going back to the early days in Cork, Ireland. And my fictional accounting tracked the lives of 2 brothers. One brother stayed in Cork, and he took care, he was the overseer of a cattle and a potato farm that his family had inherited. The other character is a fellow, the brother, goes from Ireland to New York, and he becomes a doctor in 1816. And that character is probably the one that went to America, is probably the one that most closely resembles the Phelan ancestors. The other thing that I wanted to briefly talk about is the journey in writing. I'm a first author, so for me it was an incredible journey. And while some people start out with an outline of where they're going, I have to admit that in the very beginning I really didn't know where I was going. I just knew that I was going to use the Phelan family as a backdrop, and I had a few general ideas. But what really kept me glued to staying with the project was that blank page. With that blank page, you can write anything as the writer. You can make a character happy, sad, horrid, despicable. You can do anything you want. And for me, that process was just exhilarating. However, when I decided to write, I decided I would try, even though I was going fiction, complete fiction, I was going to try and parallel some things to the Phelan legacy theme. So I knew I would need to do a lot of research, back in the 19th century, because that's when most of the history that we had. And now my Delaney family, I have people in Cork, I have people in Bordeaux, in New York, in California. So I knew I would need to do research on all those places and around those times in the mid-1800s. And that part for me was an unexpected highlight, because it was just really fun to research the historical events, and I also, the big ones, and then I also got to research the little ones, the little details. For instance, when you're writing about the 1800s, when was the first camera made? When was the first pencil made? How long did it take you to get from Cork to the U.S.? How long did it take to get from, and that took about 4 months, by the way, and back in that day. And then how long did it take you to get from California to the Isthmus of Panama to Sacramento? I had to research all those things, and some of the other things was like, what did they dress like back in the 1800s? What was the genteel protocol? What would Miss Manners of that day say was acceptable and what was not? And how did history shape cultural events? Those were just some of the things that I really enjoyed researching, to try to make everything as authentic and accurate as I could. It was that research that sparked a whole lot of ideas for the plot lines I would add. And then I'd also say at this time I became really good friends with Google and Yahoo. But getting back to the history for just a moment, what I found was the more I researched, the more I really, really enjoyed weaving the history with little bits of historical facts into my storyline. As an example, there's a chapter in the book about two Delaney family members. One's a patriarch, that's Jack, and his wife Megan, and they're traveling to see their son George in California. So they take that steamship from New York through the Isthmus of Panama, and they get to Sacramento. But before that, when they are just off the coast of Cuba, they are in danger of being attacked by the Confederate Navy. And this is about the 1863, when the Civil War is in full blown. So there's a conversation between two crew members on the steamship that mentions a steamship by the name of the Ariel. That was the name of the steamship, and that was captured by the Confederate Navy. Well, you will find, if you look in the history books, there was a real aerial ship that was captured by the Confederate Navy. So, likewise, there's another reference during that same era. In July of 1863, again in the Civil War, there was a lottery for all men to be drafted into the Union Army. And at that particular time, it was July 13, that it was widely learned by a lot of people that there were a whole bunch of people that were getting dispensations, and they weren't being drafted. They were avoiding the draft. So it caused a whole bunch of riots. Anyway, you'll also find that in your history books. In order to give you one final perspective of my journey in writing the Purloined Legacy, I have 4 brief excerpts from a retrospective journal that chronicled the 2 years of writing. I wanted to share this to just give you kind of a little bit of idea what was going on in the writer's head. I start with day 7. It's not long. I'm not going through the whole 2 years. Day 7, when I started to write, I'm going to read this because it's what I wrote. When I started to write, while I had a vision with random ideas of loosely following the Phelan family history, I must confess that I forged into the project of writing without exactly knowing where I wanted the plot line to go. I just knew I was writing a novel, and I was excited. It's funny to describe where the thoughts come from. I don't really know, but I started with a young girl walking on a pier in New York. That girl was supposed to be the bride-to-be of the Phelan patriarchs, but I got excited and my writing deviated so far away from the Phelan family that I had to stop and pause and think for a minute. And it was in that quick moment of reflection that I knew that I knew for sure that I would embark on a completely fictional journey that would be fueled by some historical facts and some scenarios from the Phelan family history. I would let the plot go wherever it wanted to, where my thoughts took me. And it wasn't long before the storyline took on a life of its own, and some of the characters that I had not even planned on had come to the forefront. I was on an exciting roller coaster ride, which would make each day that I wrote invigorating. And then we jumped forward to day 30. I have written for 30 straight days. Well, actually, Chris, it was at night. It's not when I was working. I am enjoying where the storyline is going. I am starting to form an outline in my mind. but it's not concrete yet. But that doesn't seem to bother me. I am willing to see where my thoughts take me, so I just keep on writing. I'm having such a good time. Okay, now we go to day 240, which is 8 months. 240 days, which is 8 months. It has now been 8 months, and I have finished the first complete draft of my book. While I know that my next steps are to edit and revise, I have a sense of satisfaction. I'm looking forward to this stage of revising, as I am beginning to get a better feel for recasting sentences, tightening the plot, and the characters. Although it's a hard task to cut out a chapter that I spent 3 or 4 days writing, I know that it is sometimes necessary. I also know that it is time to really concentrate on every word that I have written and whether those words move the story forward and whether some of those words are really even necessary at all. This is a very hard part of the writing process, but I'm excited to venture forward. And then the last journey I entitled, I've been writing for 2 years now. Okay, although the first draft of my book was finished at the end of the 8th month of writing, as I learned later, it was anything but finished. As a new fictional writer, what I learned is that after a writer gets the basic story plot down on paper, it is the editing and revising stage when the magic or lack of it happens. Since month 8, I have written and rewritten chapters. I've cut chapters that I really loved, but they didn't fit anymore into the storyline. I added storyline, I tweaked the plot, I tightened the dialogue. I'm now on the 6th or 7th draft, and my editor, God bless her, read every single draft, all 350 pages of it. And I could not have continued this process without her enthusiasm and direct honesty to help. Thanks, Hope. There are a lot more journal entries, but I'm not going to bore you. What I wanted to impart by reading those short excerpts is that the writing process for the Purloined Legacy was a labor of love for me, and it was an effort for me to take you on a journey that hopefully catapults you back to the 19th century and also takes you on a mysterious journey where you are engaged to put the bits and pieces as Samantha and her friend Brett try to solve Madame Bovair's puzzle of what happened to her family and her desire for justice to prevail. I want to thank you all for coming. I am so thrilled. I think the protocol, Steve said that I should open up for a little question answers if anybody has any questions. If you don't, I'll read questions.
While you were writing, did you have to give up reading other books?
I did.
So for 2 years you didn't read any
I
books?
did not, because I didn't want to be influenced by any writer. I didn't want to think that, like, you know, some writer says something really cool and you go, I'm going to do that. So I didn't. I haven't read a book in actually 3 years, because the last year I've been working on the sequel to the Purloined Legacy. So it's been 3 years since I read a book. The sequel should be out in September, October. Any other questions?
How did you come up with the title?
Oh, I don't. There were a lot of titles that I came up with. I honestly can't answer that. Do you remember, Hope?
I do not.
I don't either. We worked with a lot of titles.
There were many titles.
There were many titles.
There was that one.
Yeah, and then we worked with Mark to do the cover, and there were a couple drafts of that, but I didn't send him much, and he just went with it. And
I haven't looked up how to spell purloin.
And Molly's name.
Yeah. What? The movie. Yeah. Any other questions?
When I looked at the cover, the blood stain looked like a key. Is that supposed to be that? Or
Oh,
just turned out
that's interesting.
turned out to be that?
Oh, no.
I
It had,
didn't see that.
I wish I had been that clever. Maybe you were the one that was clever. Yeah, you were.
I thought it looked like state of Florida.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the name of the sequel?
It's called The Perilous Legacy. So it's going to take place 1 year after the Purloined Legacy finishes in the storyline. That's all I'm telling you.
So it'll take its own twists and turns.
It will. It will. It's a little bit different, but it's hopefully will take you on a journey that you'll enjoy. Any other questions? Yes.
Typewriter or computer?
Word processor.
Actually, you know, the way I did it was the old-fashioned way. I had a laptop going, I had our office computer going, and then I would read what I had written, and I would edit that way. And then because I went through a lot of editing stages actually before Hope even got it. So you can imagine how many. If she read 7 drafts, I wrote a lot of, I made a lot of editing changes. But I didn't use a typewriter.
Apparently they don't exist anymore.
I have my grandmother's old typewriter. It's probably an antique.
It's a value.
It's an antique now. Yeah.
So this is not a question; it's a statement. So I'm from Ireland originally,
Okay.
and
Well, I hope I really didn't blow it when I
no,
was
I'm really excited about reading your not only reading it but sharing it in Ireland. I'm sure
Oh,
you'll be
that's
really
awesome.
interested. Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I really hope you like it. If you don't like it, you're going to tell everybody the same
No.
thing. That's really cool. Anybody else?
Is it true that you honed your fiction writing skills by reviewing Chuck's
It is.
briefs over the years?
I read them, and I read them, and I read them, and then I decided, oh, I better write something else. I can't do that legal mumbo jumbo, you know.
This is off the book topic. Are you at the 200 South Biscayne
Yes.
office?
Yes.
And how long you said?
Over 21 years.
I've been in that same building for 15 years.
Oh, and
I'm sure I've seen you
how
out
you run
many
into?
times.
You were in that same building too?
Yeah, 16th floor.
Most of the people here are from that building. Any other questions? That's it.
So
Okay.
you'll sign.
I am going to sign. Yes. Thank you so much for coming. You made my very first book event for my very first book very memorable, and I thank you very much.
Folks, thanks for coming. We have the books, of course, for selling on the